I remember that evening with a clarity that surprises me still, though most of my memories from that week drift like half-heard music across a quadrangle. I had walked without purpose, or with the sort of purpose that men adopt when they no longer trust their own reasons. The day had cooled into something gentler, and Oxford, in that hour between sun and lamplight, carried the scent of warm bread from the Turl Street bakery as though it wished to console me. I paused there, as I often did, not for hunger but for the reassurance of something ordinary and human rising in the air. The unlatched window above the bakery shifted slightly, a faint movement I caught only because a street lamp flickered at the wrong moment. I thought little of it then. Windows open, windows shut. People forget things or remember them too sharply. I had no idea that the loose hinge would return to me later with a kind of cruel insistence. At the time, it was merely another tremor in a city full of them. Lewis rang me just as the first drops of rain tapped against the stones near the gate to Brasenose Lane. His voice carried the familiar mixture of patience and mild exasperation, as though he expected me to have wandered somewhere far less predictable. He told me an anonymous letter had arrived at the station earlier, written in a hand that tried too hard to be neat. It referred to a death in Turl Street that never should have happened. No explanation? No signature. Just those few unsettling words. I heard myself say that plenty of deaths never should have happened, though even then I knew I was avoiding the uneasier question he meant to ask. After the call ended, I found myself drifting back toward the bakery, toward the place where the window still hung ajar. Something in the air pressed its way into my thoughts. Not the smell of bread this time, but the faint sting of yeast on a cooling wind, the kind that comes just before an argument breaks or a secret slips into the wrong ear. I looked up again at the window. It seemed to tilt at an angle that hinted at neglect, but there was also a lightness in its motion, as if someone had opened it hurriedly and left without quite meaning to. A student passed behind me, his arms full of books, the pages dampening slightly as the drizzle thickened. He muttered something about lectures being pointless in the rain. The remark made little sense to me, but the cadence of his voice reminded me of a crossword clue I'd attempted earlier that morning. The answer had eluded me, a 7-letter word for someone who observes yet remains unspoken. Lookout, perhaps, though it hadn't fit at the time. I wondered, absurdly, whether the city itself was providing clues for puzzles I had not yet been asked to solve. I leaned against the cold stone arch near the bakery entrance and watched the world darken. The rain grew more confident, tracing thin silver lines down the window above. I tried to imagine the person who might have opened it, someone careless, someone hurried, someone was frightened. The letter's accusation lingered like a question I had once forgotten to answer. When I finally turned away, the night had settled firmly, and the smell of the bread had softened into something nearly mournful. I walked home with a faint but not unfamiliar sense that Oxford had begun whispering one of its quiet tragedies again, expecting, as ever, that I would eventually listen. And I suppose I did. I always did. There are places in Oxford where the past breathes more heavily than the present, and the Porter's Lodge at Wrenford is one of them. It's a narrow chamber of worn wood and muttered certainties, where the scent of dusted velvet mingles with pipe smoke, even long after the last match has gone cold. I stood there that morning, nursing a reluctant headache and a growing suspicion, while the senior porter, a man named Cleves, flicked back through the lodge logbook with the caution of someone paging through scripture. He pointed to the name Oliver Beck, entered 6:43 p.m., left blank. No time recorded for exit. I asked what that usually meant. He shrugged, said something about forgetfulness. But it wasn't the sort of forgetfulness that grew from routine. It had a shape, a deliberate edge. I leaned closer, noticed the faint impression of another entry erased beneath it. A different time, perhaps, or a name that no longer wished to be remembered. The ink left behind a pressure the eye barely saw, but the mind could not quite ignore. Cleves added, almost offhandedly, that Beck had visited Dr. Serena Vale's rooms that evening. He said it with the tone of a man dropping a stone into a well he didn't want to measure. I asked if anyone else had gone up to that floor later, but his answer came too easily, like a rehearsed line he'd had occasion to offer before. "Only Dr. Vale," he said. "And Beck, of course." Then a pause. There might have been a college scout delivering linen. The detail came to him with theatrical hesitation. He wouldn't swear to it. It was raining again when Lewis and I stepped out into the quad. The stone underfoot was slick with memory, and I felt the echo of footsteps that no longer belonged to anyone. Lewis had that look he wore when trying not to prod me. He asked what I thought. I told him I didn't know yet, which was true, but I was beginning to know what it wasn't. We made our way to Beck's former lodging, a thin attic space above the bakery. The assistant downstairs, a girl called Isla, spoke with the soft indifference of someone not wanting to be dragged into anything large. She remembered hearing raised voices. A man's, mostly. Then something quieter. A thud. A footfall? A hush. She couldn't be sure. She said the words with the delicacy of someone trying not to disturb the air. Upstairs, the room still held the shape of Beck's last hour. A damp grey light pooled through the window. His books sat in tentative piles, dog-eared with sudden intention. Nothing scattered, nothing wild. No note, no farewell. I've seen suicide, and this didn't feel like one. Not quite. On the floor by the desk, Lewis picked up a bookmark, Renford College Library, marginally creased, its corner torn. I turned it over and found a penciled phrase in neat capitals, "Don't forget the latch." It struck me then, but not clearly, like hearing a line from a forgotten poem in a crowd. A warning, a reminder, a note left for someone else? I pocketed it before Lewis could ask, and let the silence fill in what neither of us could say. The window above the bakery, I now realized, was more than a detail. It had been seen, felt, perhaps even held. Later, back in my room, I opened the logbook photograph I'd taken. I stared at the faint erasure beneath Beck's name, tracing the shadow of a time that no longer existed. It was 7:21, I was almost certain. Someone else had been recorded there once and then quietly removed. Oxford is a city that edits its own memory, but sometimes the ink remains, pressed faintly between the lines. If there is one thing I've learned in all my years wandering Oxford's cloisters, it is that intelligence rarely protects a person from sorrow. Sometimes it amplifies it. That morning, as Lewis and I walked beneath the wet branches along Merton Street, I felt the city preparing its usual cast of the brilliant and the bruised. We were to meet 3 of them, each neatly positioned within Beck's final hours, each carrying their own quiet burden. I felt the weight of their stories before I even heard their words. Dr. Serena Vale received us in her rooms at Renford, the air steeped in the faint scent of lilies, elegant, calculated, almost defensive. She was the kind of woman Oxford produces with unsettling precision, self-contained, luminous, and weary in ways she didn't wish examined. She asked whether Oliver had left any message for her, as though the answer might steady something within her. I said only that we were establishing a timeline. She mentioned his research, the pressures, the expectations he placed upon himself. Then, in the middle of a sentence, she reached for a quotation saying something about the secret of the world being written in tears and attributed it to Matthew Arnold. It wasn't Arnold, and the error jolted me. Serena Vale was not a woman who misremembered poets. I let the moment pass, a small blemish on a polished surface, but it lingered afterward like a discordant note in an otherwise well-tuned aria. Peter Armory, Beck's colleague, met us in the dim hush of the college library, where the smell of old paper clung to the air like memory. He had the pallor of someone who slept poorly and explained that Oliver had been distant lately. Distracted. Jealousy flickered behind his words, though he tried to bury it beneath a scholar's restraint. He insisted Beck had attended a poetry gathering the night he died. But the way he avoided my gaze when he said it told me more than the sentence itself. People lie most easily when they think the truth is harmless. Eleanor Marsh, the owner of the bakery beneath Beck's room, had the practical intelligence of someone used to waking before dawn. She watched us with the calm of a woman who'd already taken the measure of our intentions. She said Beck was quiet but polite, that he bought the same loaf every Tuesday. She remembered the night of his death sharply, the clatter of something above her ceiling, a brief voice raised, then silence. When I asked if she'd recognized the voice, she said it wasn't Oliver's. Too light, she added. Too careful. 3 people. 3 fragments. None complete. Back in my office, I laid out the pieces on the desk, metaphorically at least. The misquoted poet. The half-truth about a poetry gathering that never took place. The bakery owner's insistence that a woman's voice had drifted through the floorboards moments before the fall. Each fragment held its own faint hum, but they did not yet speak to one another. I reached absently for the crossword I'd been working on earlier. One clue stared back at me. 7 letters. Means of concealment. The answer presented itself with mild irritation, cover-up. A word too clean for the sort of human muddle we seemed to be stumbling into, yet it lingered in my mind with unwelcome insistence. As evening settled, a thin whistle of wind rattled the office window, reminding me of the unlatched frame above the bakery. A small detail, negligible perhaps, but it moved with the same unsteady rhythm as Serena's misquotation, and I felt, without yet understanding why both belonged to the same quiet truth, waiting patiently at the threshold. Oxford is never generous with answers. It gives you only whispers and expects you to follow them into the dark. I've often believed that the quietest rooms hold the loudest truths, and Beck's attic was no exception. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains with a kind of hesitant resolve, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like unspoken words. I remember standing just inside the doorway, unwilling to cross the threshold too quickly, as though the room might recoil from being studied again. Lewis waited behind me, respectful of whatever private contemplation he imagined I required. The desk was where Beck had left it, angled toward the window, the chair pulled back an inch or 2, as though he had risen abruptly or been interrupted mid-thought. Papers were stacked neatly, with an almost academic politeness. And then there was the diary, a small, black-bound thing lying half open on the desk, its pages inked in a careful hand. But one very particular page had been excised so precisely that it left behind a faint ghost of its absence. A careful tear, not a hurried one, the fibers parting as though persuaded rather than forced. I traced the edge of the torn page with a fingertip. On the page that followed, an indentation remained, like the pressure of a sentence not meant to survive. The faint outline of a phrase emerged when I tilted the paper toward the light. Not the first time I let the words settle into me slowly. They had the peculiar flavor of a confession, though whether Beck intended it for himself or someone else, I could not yet say. Lewis remarked that the diary seemed otherwise complete. I told him that completeness was often an illusion. It was the missing pieces that dictated the shape of the whole. He asked whether I thought Beck had torn it out himself. The question hung there, suspended in the stillness. I said only that care is a strange companion to desperate men on the verge of self-destruction who seldom tidy up after their thoughts. A soft creak drew my attention toward the window. The latch, slightly misaligned, seemed reluctant to meet its catch. I opened it gently, letting the cold air drift across the room. From below rose the faint warmth of the bakery, a sweetness that should have comforted, yet felt strangely out of place here. I tried to imagine Beck standing as I did, looking out at the cobbles, perhaps weighing something far heavier than his own frame suggested. The hinge gave a mild protest as I shut it again, a small complaint that reminded me of an elderly relative muttering under their breath. On the floor near the bed, half hidden beneath a discarded jumper, I noticed a thin envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a brief typed message with no greeting, no signature reminding Beck about a meeting 2 weeks prior. The neutrality of it struck me more than its content. People rarely use anonymity unless they have either too much to hide or too little. I tucked it carefully into my pocket, earning an inquisitive glance from Lewis that I pretended not to see. A stray thought pulled me back toward an earlier moment. Something the college scout had said about a troubling letter Beck received weeks before. It occurred to me then that letters, pages, windows, all of them openings of one sort or another, had begun circling the case like restless birds. I felt there was some pattern forming, though the pieces still refused to fall into anything so obliging as coherence. As we left the room, I took one last glance at the diary. The absence of that single page seemed suddenly far louder than anything written within it, and I remember thinking, with a kind of weary certainty, that in Oxford, the truth is often removed long before anyone notices the empty space it leaves behind. There are evenings when the past refuses to remain politely in its grave, and that night was one of them. I'd returned home later than intended, my coat damp from a rain that seemed unwilling to commit to either drizzle or downpour. The flat felt unusually still, as though it too had braced itself for whatever thoughts I was about to drag into it. I poured a glass of red wine, a modest bottle I'd been saving for an occasion that never arrived, and sat at my desk with the case files spread before me like chapters of an unfinished confession. Beck's torn diary page weighed on my mind, but so did the look in Serena Vale's eyes when she'd misquoted Arnold. It had been a small slip, a fragile fracture in her composure, but it had lingered with the stubborn insistence of a word on the tip of one's tongue. I took a slow sip of wine, hoping its warmth might soften the edge of my thoughts, but it only seemed to sharpen them. There was a particular file I hadn't opened in years, a folder wedged between older, less cooperative memories. I reached for it almost without deciding to, as though drawn by a hand gentler than logic. Inside lay a scattering of photographs from the late 80s, staff dinners, college fetes, and those painfully orchestrated group photographs where no one quite knows what to do with their hands. I hadn't looked at them since the day I'd tucked them away, unwilling to confront the version of myself they preserved. It was the third photograph that arrested me. A young Serena Vale, scarcely older than her students now, standing beside a man whose features possessed a certain quiet intensity. His expression carried something I recognized, not exactly, but a kind of earnestness that the years would later erode. He resembled Beck in ways I couldn't easily dismiss, not a likeness so much as an echo, the kind that ripples backward more than forward. I traced the man's face with a fingertip and felt the uncomfortable tightening that accompanies a memory one had hoped would never be needed again. Lewis rang then. His voice filtered through the static of rain against the window. He told me Strange had found something peculiar. The librarian at Renford had mentioned Beck requesting access to the restricted archives a fortnight earlier. She'd described it with an offhand ambiguity, as though she'd already rehearsed the line. I asked Lewis whether the request had been granted. He hesitated, always a sign that he hoped I might abandon the question. It hadn't, he said. Beck had been told the materials were unavailable due to preservation concerns. A tidy lie, if a lie it was. After the call, I turned the photograph over. On the back, in thin pencil strokes, someone had written Summer Gathering, 1987. Only that. No names, no flourish. But the handwriting wasn't Serena's, and that mattered more than I wished it to. I poured another measure of wine, though it did nothing to clear the mist that drifted across my thoughts. I tried to recall the man's name, a lecturer, a visiting scholar, someone whose presence had seemed meaningful at the time and then dissolved into the vague river of college gossip. But nothing came. Instead, an unsettling notion began to take shape that Beck might have discovered something not only academic, but personal, an echo from decades earlier that had somehow found its way into the present. I set the photograph aside and opened my crossword, more for the ritual than any hope of solving it. One clue hovered near the bottom, 8 letters, a past event that returns. I stared at it for longer than necessary before the answer slid quietly into place, a word that seemed almost too theatrical for my liking, yet it lingered with an uncomfortable accuracy. Outside, the rain deepened. The wine settled into its familiar melancholy, and as I sat there, the past and present wove themselves into a single thread, thin, fragile, and pulling steadily towards something I had not yet seen, but would soon no longer be able to avoid. The Bodleian has never been a place for swift revelations. It is a cathedral of hesitations, a sanctuary for questions that prefer to postpone their answers. That morning, as I stepped beneath its vaulted hush, I felt the familiar tightening of the chest that comes when one carries too many half-formed suspicions into a room built for permanence. The smell of old bindings and cold stone accompanied me to the librarian's desk, where Miss Renfield greeted us with a politeness so polished it verged on impenetrable. Lewis asked about Beck's attempt to access the restricted archives. She confirmed it with the faintest inclination of the head, adding that he had seemed flustered, unusually so for a postgraduate accustomed to academic labyrinths. I watched her hands as she spoke, slender, precise, never lingering too long in any one gesture. When I asked why Beck's request had been denied, she offered a rehearsed explanation about conservation priorities, the delicate condition of certain manuscripts, and the regrettable backlog. The words flowed with the smoothness of well-worn justifications. But it was the pause, that tiny hesitation before she said unavailable, that caught my attention. A small slip, nothing overt, but enough to prick at the skin. People rarely pause over the truth. She fetched the archive ledger at my request, and I skimmed the entries with the quiet fanfare of someone pretending not to hope for too much. There was Beck's name, neatly entered, and beneath it a red stamp indicating refusal. What I had expected to find another name crossing paths with him was conspicuously absent, a blankness that felt too careful. Miss Renfield insisted that no one else had inquired about the same manuscript. Lewis accepted this with an ease I envied, though he glanced at me afterwards, likely waiting for whatever doubt I was already forming. We thanked her and made our way into the upper reading room, where the silence is so profound it seems carved rather than heard. Beck's requested manuscript of an old thesis on college scandals of the late 80s had supposedly been brought up for staff review earlier that month, although no record existed of who had initiated the process. I held the folder in my hands, its edges softened by time, and felt a disappointment I wasn't prepared to admit aloud. There was nothing inside that linked Beck to anything dangerous. No revelation, no scandal, only the dusty remnants of an incident long forgotten by everyone except, perhaps, those who feared remembering it. Lewis reminded me that plenty of leads crumble on first touch. I muttered something about the Bodleian being a master at turning certainty into smoke. The truth was simpler. I had wanted this to be the thread that tugged the case into shape. Instead, it loosened everything again. We walked down the creaking staircase toward the exit, passing students bowing over their books with monastic devotion. I found myself thinking about Miss Renfield's pause, the slight tremor of her fingertips when she replaced the ledger. It was barely perceptible, the kind of detail most would file under nerves or fatigue. But it had the texture of fear, the quiet, personal sort that grows from involvement rather than mere knowledge. Outside, the clouds sagged low over Radcliffe Square, and the chill in the air wrapped itself around my thoughts. A crossword clue from the morning paper came back to me, then 5 letters. Means of misleading oneself. I'd penciled in maybe, but now I wondered if the answer had always been dream. Or worse, want. We had come to the Bodleian searching for a truth Beck might have uncovered. Instead, we left with a truth of our own that we were looking in the wrong place, or at the wrong people, or perhaps for the wrong reason entirely. And yet, even false starts have their uses. They leave behind echoes faint, stubborn, and unwilling to quiet themselves long after you've stepped back into the waiting rain. It was late afternoon when Lewis and I found ourselves walking toward the little bookshop on Holywell Street, the one where Peter Armory claimed the poetry reading had taken place. Oxford looked washed out, as though the sky had been drained of conviction. I remember thinking that the city always seemed to fold itself into smaller, quieter dimensions when a lie waited beneath its paving stones. The bookshop was dark, locked. A handwritten sign in the window announced that it had been closed for refurbishment for the past week, though the ink had not yet faded from the page. Lewis observed the obvious first that no poetry reading could have occurred there on the night Beck died. But it was the phrasing of the sign that caught my attention, reopening soon depending on repairs. Such fragile ambiguity, so carefully worded that it felt almost guilty. A neighbor leaning from an upstairs window told us the owners were abroad and had been for days. He added with a theatrical sigh that the building was always in a state of near collapse. I listened only half-heartedly. What concerned me was the memory of Peter's voice when he insisted Beck had been there. The quiet urgency of it. Men lie easily about jealousy, they lie less easily about fear. We left the street behind, making our way toward the river where the air seemed calmer. Lewis asked whether I thought Peter had been protecting himself or someone else. I told him I hadn't yet decided, though the answer had already begun to form in that unlit corner of the mind where deduction begins not with reason, but with discomfort. At the college, Peter waited for us in the JCR, his posture drawn tight as though he had rehearsed several versions of the truth and found none of them bearable. He spoke quickly, too quickly, describing the supposed reading again, the poems, the wine, the thin turnout. I let him continue, then mentioned, as gently as I could, that the bookshop had been closed. He stopped mid-sentence. The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise, it was the silence of a man realizing he has misjudged the distance between himself and the truth. He said Beck had wanted to talk, but not there. They had been meant to meet earlier in the week, but Beck had cancelled or postponed or drifted away in that evasive manner Peter seemed both resentful of and wounded by. When I asked what Beck wanted to discuss, Peter hesitated. He said it was about research, something Beck had stumbled upon that unsettled him, but the way Peter's hands tightened around the edge of the table told me it had not been academic alone. Emotion leaves fingerprints long after logic has wiped the surface clean. Lewis excused himself to fetch some coffee, leaving me alone with Peter's unease. I asked whether he had visited Beck's room the night of the fall. Peter looked down, the faint tremor in his jaw betraying him before his words did. He said no. But the denial hovered there, limp and unconvincing. People who tell the truth rarely need to steady their breathing first. When we stepped back outside, evening had begun smudging itself across the quad. A phrase floated into my thoughts, then one from a half-finished crossword I had abandoned that morning. 6 letters, means of avoidance. I'd left it blank earlier, but now evasion fits too neatly to be ignored. Walking toward the gate, I told Lewis that Peter had lied, though not skillfully. He asked why. I said that lies are rarely about the event itself. They're about the fear that surrounds it. Peter had feared something, not exposure, not guilt, but perhaps the knowledge that Beck had discovered a truth neither of them wished to touch. As the bell from the cathedral tower drifted across the roofs, I felt the shape of the case shift almost imperceptibly. The poetry reading had never happened, and yet it left behind an absence so loud it was impossible not to hear. I went back to the bakery the following morning, long before the first warmth of the ovens had made its way into the street. There are hours in Oxford when the city feels half asleep, suspended between breath and memory, and it was in that peculiar hush that I found myself staring once again at the window above the shop. It hung slightly ajar, as though caught between two decisions, and for a moment I felt uncomfortably aware of how many of us lived in that same uncertain angle. Eleanor Marsh greeted me with the weariness of someone who had spent a restless night replaying old sounds in her head. She asked whether we were any closer to understanding what had happened. I told her the truth, that understanding was never the problem. It was a certainty I struggled with. She nodded as though the distinction mattered and led me to the narrow stairwell at the back of the bakery, where flour clung to the air like a muted snowfall. Halfway up she hesitated, her hand resting on the rail. She said she had omitted something the last time we spoke. Not a deliberate lie, she insisted, just a detail that had returned to her slowly, like a dream refusing to vanish. On the night Beck fell, she had looked up from the shop front and seen a figure at his window. Not Beck, someone slimmer, with hair that caught the street lamp's glow. Long hair, she said. A woman, perhaps, or someone who wanted to appear as one. Lewis joined us then, slightly out of breath, and listened as Eleanor repeated her account. He asked whether she could make out the face. She shook her head, only the shape, a kind of softened outline against the glass. The figure had been leaning outward, she said, as though steadying themselves on the sill, or perhaps urging someone back inside. I climbed the remaining steps slowly, Eleanor's words swirling with the faint smell of yeast rising from below. In Beck's room, the window seemed even more precarious than before. A thin crust of dust rested along the outer edge of the sill, disturbed in two distinct patches. Not a full handprint, more the faint ghosts of fingertips. Someone had braced themselves there. Someone had needed to. I bent closer and saw a small flake of varnish curled near the hinge, the kind that splinters when a window has been forced open too quickly, the kind that belongs to haste or fear. Lewis asked whether Beck could have done it. I said he might have, but the spacing of the marks told a different story. Narrower, lighter, hesitant. A woman's hand, perhaps, or simply a careful one. The room felt strangely heavier as I stood there, as though the air itself held the echo of a confrontation. I pictured Beck by the desk, the torn diary page already missing. Someone else near the window, caught between leaving and staying. Words exchanged that would later be remembered only in fragments. A voice raised. A silence followed too abruptly. Lewis found an old scarf tucked beneath the radiator. Pale blue, delicately woven. Not Beck's style. When he held it up, a faint scent drifted into the room's lilies. Serena Vale's preferred flower, though I said nothing aloud. Deduction doesn't always arrive as certainty, more often it arrives as discomfort. Before we left, I lingered by the window once more. The street below had begun to brighten, and the bakery sign creaked faintly in the wind. I ran my hand along the sill, feeling the subtle indentations left by someone who had stood there before me. Some truths hide themselves in the softest marks, a smudge of dust, a flake of varnish, the memory of a voice rising through a floorboard. And as we descended the stairs, I realized the case no longer revolved around how Beck had fallen, but who had stood with him at the edge of the window when the world gave way. There are moments in an investigation when everything appears to drift sideways, as though the case itself has grown tired of the shape I forced upon it. That evening, back in my room with the rain stuttering fitfully against the window, I felt that familiar sense of misalignment. I poured a modest measure of whiskey and sat before the scattered notes that had accumulated like autumn leaves along the edge of my desk. The day had left a dull ache behind my eyes, the sort that signals not failure exactly, but resistance. The crossword lay beneath a stack of reports, half smothered by other half-answers. I tugged it free with the faint irritation of someone hoping for distraction. A single clue stared up at me, 7 letters. One who sees yet never speaks. I'd toyed with lookout earlier, dismissed it, returned to it out of boredom, then dismissed it again. Now, in the unsteady lamplight, the word pulsed with a quiet insistence. Lookout. A watcher, a silent witness. Someone present but unnoticed. It was the sort of metaphor Beck might have woven into a diary page. And the torn entry, with its cryptic indentation about the window not being the first time, echoed faintly in the back of my mind. I felt the tentative beginnings of a connection taking shape, linking Beck's coded habit of observing the world through oblique angles with the faint clues he'd left scattered through his belongings. I reached for the scarf we had found beneath the radiator, pale blue, delicately woven. A faint scent of lilies lingered there still, a signature far harder to erase than ink. I thought of Serena Vale then, the way her eyes had tightened momentarily when we'd mentioned Beck's final days. People often hide their guilt behind intellect. They hope complexity might disguise the simplicity of a secret. But guilt, in my experience, has a way of leaking through even the smallest cracks. Lewis had spent the afternoon chasing down a lead of his own, a trail of library card entries, small and mundane. He'd rung earlier to say that Beck had checked out a collection of coded poetry fragments several weeks before his death. He'd sounded apologetic, as though offering me crumbs when I had demanded bread. But crumbs, I've learned, often led further than loaves. I flipped through Beck's notebook again, letting the pages fall open where they wished. A line caught my eye, written in the margin of a lecture summary. Truth waits in the wings. Not Beck's phrasing, a reference then, and not to Arnold this time. When Serena had misquoted earlier, she had not misremembered. She had replaced the truth with a safer version, as academics often do when the real source is too raw to revisit. If Beck had discovered something from Serena's past, a memory, a former lover, a regret that refused to fade, he might have confronted her. Not out of malice, but out of the restless compulsion that gifted minds often possess. And if Serena had felt that past closing in on her again, she might have gone to his room, perhaps intending an explanation, perhaps something else. Standing at the window's edge, hands trembling, the varnish splintered, the dust disturbed. The lookout for the witness was there in the marks. I set the notebook aside, letting the whiskey warm its slow path through me. The case felt closer now, though still covered in fog. The kind of fog Oxford excels at producing, not the weathered sort, but the emotional kind that clings to people who have carried their sorrow too privately for too long. A second crossword clue caught my eye, tucked into the bottom corner of the page. 4 letters. A truth half seen. I smiled despite myself when the answer arrived with a soft hint of inevitability. For that was all Beck had left us. Nothing explicit, nothing certain, just the faint gesture of a hand pointing somewhere beyond the frame. As I extinguished the lamp, the rain thickened against the glass, and I felt a strange pull toward the window above the bakery once more, a window that had witnessed more than anyone had realized, and which now seemed to whisper quietly through the night, urging me not to look away. I remember standing once more in Beck's narrow room, the late afternoon light slanting in with that particular Oxford gloom which never decides whether to grey the world or illuminate it. The window hung there, crooked and stubborn, as though protesting its own involvement. I felt an odd reluctance to touch it again, as if doing so might disturb whatever fragile truth still clung to the frame. Lewis waited behind me, respectful, though I sensed his uncertainty. He asked whether I thought we were at the end of something. I told him, not quite honestly, that endings were rarer than people imagined. The sill bore the marks I had traced earlier, the faint dents of fingertips, the slight peeling of varnish. They seemed even more eloquent now that the echoes of Serena's voice drifted through my memory. The misquotation, the half-averted gaze, the tremor disguised as composure. I imagined her standing where I stood, looking out at the street below, perhaps wishing the past would loosen its grip or fearing it already had. A person leaning on a window to steady themselves leaves a certain signature, and this window had collected more than one. Lewis lifted the scarf again, its pale blue soft against the gloom. He asked if I thought it belonged to her. I said that belonging was a complicated word. People often leave pieces of themselves where they most wish they hadn't. The lilies in the fabric lingered, faint but insistent. It was the scent of someone who had lost something long ago and feared losing it again. The diary's missing page resurfaced in my thoughts. Not the first time the window A phrase that felt like a confession Beck never had the chance to finish. Or perhaps he had finished it, and someone else had decided the page was better gone. The care with which it had been removed still troubled me. Care suggests intention, and intention is rarely innocent. When Lewis stepped aside to answer a call from Strange, I was left alone with the room's quiet. I ran my hand along the frame, feeling the subtle imbalance in the wood. It had not been designed to hold much weight. A struggle need not be violent to unseat a person from their balance. A single step backward, a moment of shock, a breath caught too late. I could almost see Serena reaching for Beck, not to harm him but to anchor herself, and in that moment the window had become a participant in their private undoing. Strange's call ended with little progress, procedural murmurs, departmental concerns. Lewis relayed them dutifully, though I heard only fragments. My mind was with the photograph from 1987, the young man whose likeness to Beck had seemed too sharp to ignore. Whatever had happened between Serena and that man had never resolved itself. Some stories, even the quiet ones, coil themselves into the present without warning. I found myself speaking aloud before I realized the window was never meant to open that far. Lewis asked me to repeat myself, but I shook my head. There are thoughts that diminish when shared. The hinge, the dust, the varnish, each had its own small voice, and together they whispered a story of panic rather than malice, of a past colliding clumsily with the present, of two people standing too close to the edge of more than one kind of precipice. As we left the room, I paused once more, letting my eyes settle on the crooked frame. It seemed almost resigned now, a witness weary of its burden. I understood a little of that feeling. Some truths stay open long after they should have been closed, and others close themselves too late to save anyone from the fall that follows. The letter arrived in the early evening, slipped beneath my door with a quietness that suggested either courtesy or cowardice. I found it resting against the skirting board like something abandoned, its envelope unmarked, except for my name written in a hand I recognized immediately. Serena Vale had always written with an elegance that seemed to apologize for whatever burden her words might impose. I carried it to the desk and set it beside the cold remains of a cup of tea I had forgotten to drink. For a long while, I simply looked at it. There are messages that feel heavier before they are even opened, as though the paper itself has absorbed a portion of someone's sorrow. When I finally slid the letter free, the faint scent of lilies drifted upward, unsettling in its beauty. The page inside held only a few lines, copied in, a hand steadier than I had expected. It was the poem she had misquoted when we first spoke, rendered now with absolute accuracy, as though she wished to correct more than the words. At the bottom, she had written only that I feared the past more than the truth. Lewis arrived moments later, carrying a stack of statements and an expression that suggested he had prepared himself for disappointment. When he saw the letter on the desk, he asked whether she had confessed. I told him she had, though not in any form that would be a comfort procedure. He lowered himself into the armchair with the reluctant care of a man expecting to hear something he could not easily make sense of. I explained, in the quietest terms I could manage, that Serena had not intended harm. Beck had confronted her about the old photograph, about the man whose likeness he carried unknowingly, a resemblance that had become unbearable for her, stirring a grief she had spent half her life trying to bury. Lewis said something about how memory can twist a person. I nodded, though I wondered whether twist was the right word. Sometimes, memory simply refuses to loosen its grip, no matter how gently one tries to pull away. Serena had gone to Beck's room that night seeking explanation, perhaps forgiveness. The diary page he had torn out, the one describing the window not being the first time, had unsettled her. She feared what he understood, and even more what he might reveal. The letter enclosed that missing page, folded with a precision that bordered on tenderness. Beck had written of watching her from the quad, of recognizing something fragile in her before he even knew her name. Not love, not infatuation, something quieter, the kind of recognition that startles a person who prefers to remain unseen. He had wanted to help her understand that resemblance was not destiny, but he had approached it clumsily, unaware of the depth of her old wound. I thought back to the marks on the windowsill, the softened imprint of fingers steadying themselves against wood too thin to hold them. Serena had held Beck's arm, trying to stop him from leaving, trying to prevent the truth from spilling into a world that would not care for its delicacy. Panic had shaped the moment, not malice, and the window, unstable and unkind, had answered for them both. When Lewis asked what would become of her, I said I didn't know. Oxford had its ways of swallowing such tragedies into the folds of its architecture. Some things are recorded, others politely forgotten. But the letter on my desk, its restrained pain, its unwilling honesty, felt like a confession that needed no courtroom. As the evening deepened, I folded the letter gently and placed it back into its envelope. Not to hide it, but simply because some truths, once spoken, ask only to be held quietly, without judgment, without explanation, without the cruelty of finality. I walked along Turl Street that night with the uneasy calm that follows the closing of a case which never truly closes. The rain had begun in thin, uncertain lines, brushing the air as though testing the city's willingness to be washed clean. It carried the scent of the bakery below Beck's old room, warm yeast rising through the damp, a reminder that ordinary life endures even when the truth refuses to settle. I stopped beneath the window, now firmly latched, its stubborn hinge no longer shifting in the wind. A small, insignificant correction to the architecture, yet it felt strangely final. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, leaving me with the lingering silence of someone who understands that their questions have outlived their usefulness. He had asked whether I believed Serena's letter absolved her. I told him absolution was a theological concern we dealt only in explanations. But he pressed me as gently as Lewis ever pressed, wanting a certainty no one in Oxford could offer. I said the closest thing to the truth was that grief makes clumsy architects of us all. He accepted it, though I'm not sure he understood. The puddles along the pavement trembled as a gust of wind threaded through the narrow street. I found myself glancing up again at the window. It was remarkable how little space separated the interior from the void. A few inches of wood, a strip of metal, a breath. Beck had stood there. Serena, too. Perhaps neither intending harm, perhaps both longing for a moment to pause and breathe. The tragedy lay not in intent, but in the timing, the fragile choreography of missteps that life so often insists upon. I thought of the diary page folded inside Serena's letter, the tremulous script capturing Beck's quiet recognition of her sorrow. He had seen something of the past in her, not the man from the photograph, but the shape of mourning she carried like a shadow pinned to her shoulder. He had wanted to speak of it, to untangle it, to understand her. And yet it was precisely that instinct toward understanding that had drawn them both to the edge of danger. The rain thickened, tapping its hesitant rhythm against the cobblestones. I leaned against the cold stone wall opposite the bakery and watched as the street lamps blurred into soft halos. A line from one of Beck's borrowed poetry fragments drifted into my thoughts as sorrow leaned from every upper window. I wondered whether he had written it down because it comforted him or because he feared its truth. A cyclist passed, splashing through a shallow pool, and the world felt briefly younger, filled with people whose tragedies had not yet found them. I envied them with the mild, exhausted envy of a man who has witnessed too much of the city's quiet undoings. Oxford holds its secrets in the mortar of its walls, and from time to time they seep outward, staining the lives of those who walk too close. I took out my crossword from early that morning, already softened by the rain in my coat pocket. One final clue remained unanswered. 9 letters, something that remains open. I stared at it, letting the streetlight flicker across the wet page. Possibilities drifted through my mind, questions, wounds, stories. But the answer that settled was simpler than I'd expected. It fits too easily. It fits everything. When I finally turned away, the bakery's warmth had begun to rise more insistently, a soft counterpoint to the cold. The window above stayed closed, as if insisting upon its own silence. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that some part of the story remained unlatched, caught between what had been spoken and what had been withheld. And as I walked into the deepening rain, I felt the city breathe around me sorrowful, enduring, and endlessly alive.